Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating policy brief. It essentially lays out a highly specific blueprint for how the Democratic Party could fundamentally change America right after the next midterm elections. Seriously, if you've ever wanted to know the exact mechanics of how U.S. immigration, our demographics, and the entire legal landscape could transform literally almost overnight under unified control, well, this is the roadmap.
Let's quickly look at our agenda for today. We'll be hitting 5 key areas. First, the unified control scenario. Second, the filibuster nuclear option. Third, the DSA's immigration agenda. Fourth, the executive action precedent. And finally, the potential legislative outcomes.
Okay, moving right into Section 1, the unified control scenario, setting the stage.
So the briefs map out a very specific political reality. Imagine leaders like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries securing unified Democratic majorities in both chambers after an election. If that happens, they are perfectly positioned to move incredibly aggressively on immigration reform. And what makes this scenario so unique? Well, the source text suggests they could pull off this massive structural reform entirely independently. They wouldn't even necessarily need the White House driving it, and, crucially, they wouldn't need traditional bipartisan consensus. It's basically a master blueprint to bypass decades of Washington gridlock.
Which brings us to Section 2, the filibuster nuclear option, bypassing gridlock.
You know how for years, the Senate's 60-vote filibuster rule has been the ultimate brick wall for sweeping immigration reform, no matter which party's in power? Enter the nuclear option. It's a parliamentary maneuver where the Senate can just override that 60-vote rule. Basically, by raising a point of order and appealing the presiding officer's ruling, they can set a brand new precedent with just a simple majority, just 51 votes. The brief suggests this is exactly the tool they'd use to bulldoze the legislative path.
The source material actually lays out a highly specific 4-step procedural pathway. Step 1, Speaker Jeffries passes a comprehensive bill through the House using a simple majority, keeping moderate members in line. Step 2, Senator Schumer brings that bill to the Senate floor and actually pulls the trigger on that nuclear option we just talked about. Step 3, they establish a highly specific carve-out just for this issue. And Step 4, final passage. The House and Senate reconcile their versions and boom, the bill becomes law, entirely without needing a single Republican vote.
Now, the absolute linchpin of this entire strategy is that third step, the targeted carve-out. The documents make it clear that eliminating the filibuster entirely for all legislation carries massive political risk. So instead, the most politically realistic route they outline is to create a one-time exception, exclusively for immigration reform. This narrows the procedural change, makes it way more palatable to those hesitant lawmakers, but still totally achieves the goal of passing the legislation with just 51 votes.
All right, let's look at Section 3, the DSA's immigration agenda, ideological drivers.
To really understand the content of the legislation this strategy would push, the briefs point straight to the DSA and aligned progressive factions. Now, the text describes them not necessarily as the lawmakers writing the bills themselves, but rather as this powerful, unyielding force on the left that simply refuses incremental compromise. They set a tremendously high ideological bar, which really shrinks the zone of acceptable moderate compromise. According to the documents, they view immigration as a key lever for broader demographic, economic, and cultural changes. Their ultimate goal? A total structural overhaul of the whole system. And the sheer scope of this policy platform is, well, it's massive. The sources detail a comprehensive list of demands. We're talking uninhibited transnational movement by demilitarizing the border, abolishing ICE and Customs and Border Protection entirely, and decriminalizing unauthorized entries. But it doesn't stop there. They demand immediate legalization and full amnesty, which includes voting rights for all undocumented people currently in the U.S., right alongside full inclusion in social services, healthcare, and labor protections, totally regardless of immigration status.
Take a look at this rhetoric, pulled directly from activist literature cited in the policy brief. All deportations are wrong. It really showcases the uncompromising stance of these progressive factions. The demand here isn't for reformed enforcement, right? It's a complete moratorium on deportations. They view the entire immigration enforcement apparatus as something to be completely abolished, framing the root causes of migration as issues of imperialism rather than just simple economics.
Moving on to Section 4, the executive action precedent, a trial run.
The really interesting thing is, the briefs don't just treat this as some theoretical exercise. They ground this legislative strategy in the recent history of the Biden-Mayorkas administration, viewing it as a sort of trial run. Because Congress has been gridlocked for decades, the executive branch basically stepped in. Under Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, a significant portion of this progressive vision was actually advanced unilaterally through executive policy. The documents literally describe these actions as a de facto implementation of the left's priorities, all without legislative approval.
10 million. It's a staggering figure, and it is heavily emphasized in the policy brief. This represents the historic high of migrant encounters recorded by U.S. Customs and Border Protection from fiscal year 2021 to 2025. To put that into perspective, it's an unprecedented scale of encounters, and the source explicitly ties it directly to the executive policy shifts initiated during this era. So the briefs outline the specific executive levers that were pulled to actually reach those numbers. This included rolling back Trump-era policies like Remain in Mexico, the widespread utilization of catch-and-release practices, and heavily reducing interior enforcement. But perhaps most notably, it involved the massive expansion of humanitarian parole for nationals from countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Haiti. This legally admitted hundreds of thousands of individuals with work authorization without waiting for Congress to act. I mean, it was a massive, real-time shift in how the whole system operates.
And that brings us to Section 5, Potential Legislative Outcomes, Locking in the Framework. The ultimate goal of this unified control scenario, according to the policy brief, is to take that executive framework we just talked about and lock it in permanently. By using that filibuster carve-out to pass these laws with a 51-vote simple majority, Democrats could codify parole expansions, institutionalize reduced deportation priorities, and enact huge increases in legal immigration and sanctuary protections right into statutory law. Think about it. Executive orders can be undone with the stroke of a pen by the next president. Statutory law, however, is incredibly difficult to reverse, meaning these changes would become deeply, deeply entrenched. Now, the documents impartially weigh the projected outcomes of codifying these policies. On one hand, supporters strongly defend this framework, crediting it with necessary labor force growth, orderly processing of claims, and vital humanitarian protections for vulnerable populations. On the flip side, critics highlight severe risks. They point to the immense fiscal strain on local city budgets, places like New York and Chicago, potential negative wage impacts on working-class Americans, and the high likelihood of encouraging renewed migration surges. As we wrap up this explainer, the policy briefs leave us with a critical reflection on the actual mechanics of American governance. I mean, recent years have shown us how rapidly executive policy can shift outcomes. But if the filibuster is neutralized to permanently cement those shifts into law with only a razor-thin partisan majority, that represents a major escalation in procedural warfare. It forces us to ask a really tough question. If these long-standing procedural hurdles are removed to enact one party's transformative agenda today, what happens to the stability of our legal order when the political pendulum inevitably swings tomorrow?